They were here before everything fell apart, not as legends but as presences that silenced the masses. If you think you know the history of humanity, breathe. There's a chapter almost no one has told, the hidden world of the giants. Called Nephilim by ancient accounts, these beings weren't just tall, they were the most extreme version of what we understand as power. Wherever they went, the ground vibrated, and people's gaze alternated between fascination and terror. They led armies, dictated fashions, controlled markets, and intimidated cities. They rewrote the rules of dominion. But who were they after all? Some said they were men of uncommon strength, the offspring of human lineages that intermingled with other tribes. Others whispered they came from above, wielding an authority that should never have trodden the earth. The truth is, when they emerged, nothing remained the same. The order that sustained the people gave way to another, one of fame, glory, and violence. Imagine waking up in an ancient city and hearing before sunrise the hammering of metal, the sound of new instruments, the hustle and bustle of commerce. It seemed like a flourishing golden age. And at the top of this pyramid, the giants rose, not in the shadows, but in the palaces, squares, and walls. They were the model and the measure. Young men copied gestures, leaders sought approval, priests reinterpreted symbols. The idea of fall permeates the narratives, a fall in values, boundaries, and coexistence. Power, which could protect, became a license to crush. Glory became a collective drug, and fame, fuel for the cult of personality, taught. Those who seem larger than life act as if they were above it all. Signs of this dominion appeared everywhere: oversized walls, thrones no common man would occupy, weapons made for hands that were not human. Chronicles speak of men of renown, heroes whose name crossed borders. They posed for history. The people posed to survive. Corruption didn't begin with open violence, but with blind admiration. First came applause, then obedience, and finally fear. Cities surrendered their hearts to the charisma of these leaders. From then on, the moral fabric tore. Merchants cheated. Generals fought for vanity. Artists extolled greatness over good. It was the triumph of spectacle over collective conscience. Perhaps that's why so many peoples have preserved memories. Names vary, details change, but the feeling is the same. Something immense passed through here. And when something like that happens, the world decides it matures or sinks. Back then, it sank. The first civilization didn't fall for lack of technology. It collapsed due to excess ego. The giants were the showcase of this excess. Today, giant evokes impossible obstacles. This is no coincidence. This word carries centuries of warning. They remind us that size is no virtue, that fame without character becomes poison, that limitless strength creates ruins. That's why this video exists, to look back and ask what happened when the earth was ruled by those who seemed larger than life itself. Get ready. We'll traverse myths, compare stories, decipher symbols, and follow the trails of these people who shaped landscapes, arts, and fears. There are no guarantees of easy answers. There's an invitation to view the giants not as fairy tales, but as mirrors of human choices we still repeat. If you see this, the mystery ceases to be merely ancient. It becomes urgent. Follow me to the end. Each clue will reveal another hidden door. If this mystery of the Nephilim has already made you see giants in a different light, just imagine what's yet to come. So, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because that's the only way to ensure you don't miss the next revelations about this hidden world that history has tried to erase. The origin of giants has always been a mystery that has endured for centuries, a mystery that seems more like legend than reality, but which has left deep marks on the memories of ancient civilizations. At some point in history, something extraordinary happened. Two different worlds intersected. Men and beings of a superior nature, called sons of God in ancient accounts, mated with human women, and from this mixture was born an unusual offspring. This lineage became known as that of the giants, imposing figures who would dominate their time. Most disturbingly, instead of being seen as aberrations, these giants became symbols of power and leadership. They were taller, stronger, and more fearless. It wasn't long before they became legendary warriors, revered leaders, and even idols in a society that no longer recognized the boundaries between what was permitted and what was forbidden. They were called men of renown, figures so well known that their names echoed from region to region, carrying both respect and fear. But how was this union possible? For some, the sons of God were nothing more than ordinary men belonging to a more spiritual lineage who decided to mingle with another marked by rebellion. For others, the explanation was quite different. Supernatural beings of fallen nature materialized in the human world, assuming physical form and breaking barriers that should never have been crossed. The second hypothesis is the darkest because it transforms the giants into something beyond human comprehension, almost hybrids, part spirit and part flesh. It's no coincidence that many ancient cultures recorded similar stories. The Greeks spoke of gods descending from Olympus to mate with mortals, producing semi-divine heroes. The peoples of Mesopotamia told of celestial entities mingling with humans, giving rise to powerful kings. Even the Egyptians preserved legends about beings who came from the heavens to rule and teach. It's as if the entire world has preserved fragments of the same memory, the arrival of a different, greater, and more powerful race that influenced the destiny of humanity. Regardless of the interpretation, the consequence was clear. From this mixture, a generation marked by violence, a thirst for power and corruption was born. What began as an attraction to beauty, as something seemingly natural, ended in a tragedy that contaminated an entire civilization. Giants not only lived among men, but dominated them, establishing a culture in which strength prevailed over justice and in which power replaced any notion of morality. And there was another detail that made this story even more disturbing. This type of union didn't happen just once. It wasn't an isolated episode, an exception forgotten in time. On the contrary, ancient accounts suggest that it became a pattern, a continuous practice that generated a whole family of descendants, spread across different regions. Soon giants went from being a rarity to a prominent presence, completely altering the social organization of the time. This origin explains why they were remembered as such different beings. It wasn't just their physical size that distinguished them, but the very essence they carried. They symbolized a transgression, a blending of worlds that should never have come together. While enchanting with their imposing nature, they also terrified with their brutality. They represented the limit that had been crossed, the collective error that transformed all of humanity. Ultimately, the story of the giants is a warning about seemingly small choices that open the door to irreversible consequences. A simple desire for unity, pleasure, or power ended up changing the trajectory of an entire civilization. The result was the emergence of a generation that should never have existed, a lineage marked by corruption from birth. These are the dark secrets of the giants' origins, an origin that cannot be explained solely by biology or culture, but rather points to a deeper secret, the human attempt to blend in with what didn't belong to it. And from this boldness arose a lineage that has left its mark to this day. Now that you understand how they came to be, the next step is to uncover who they actually became. Warriors, kings, and leaders who shaped the course of ancient humanity with their immense strength and terrifying fame. When the giants were born, they did not go unnoticed. Far beyond their unusual stature and physical strength, they quickly gained a position of power that would completely change the way society was organized. They were different, they attracted attention, and soon they ceased to be just rare individuals to become symbols of leadership, respected warriors, and even rulers of entire regions. That's why ancient accounts called them men of renown. They were no ordinary people. They were legendary figures, remembered in stories that spanned generations. Imagine walking through an ancient city and seeing in its center a man whose height far surpassed everyone else's, whose strength was enough to subdue 10 opponents at once. Such a presence required no words. He commanded respect simply by being there. These giants were the elite of the time. They held positions of command, led armies, made decisions, and shaped the destiny of entire communities. But the fame they achieved was not linked to goodness. Rather, it was the result of their ability to dominate, win battles, and subjugate other peoples. They became invincible warriors, men who were seen as demigods, capable of inspiring both awe and terror. When they appeared on the field, they were not just the greatest soldiers. They were strategists, military leaders, and leaders who commanded multitudes to obey out of fear or reverence. This image of powerful warriors was not confined to a single people. Legends of towering men who won impossible battles appear in different cultures, Peoples who never had direct contact held similar narratives, beings who were above the ordinary, whose fame spread to the farthest corners. It's as if the memory of giants had been imprinted on humanity's collective mind. And this fame wasn't limited to war. Many of them became rulers, clan chiefs, and city leaders. The logic was simple. In a society where strength represented power, the biggest and strongest naturally rose to the top. Their names circulated as a symbol of courage, but also as a warning. They were respected, feared, and at the same time, envied. The presence of giants completely changed the social balance of the time. However, this fame came at a price. By becoming leaders and role models, they also spread their corruption. There was no pursuit of justice or balance within them. On the contrary, their authority was used to impose violence, widen inequalities, and fuel human pride. Each victory in battle increased their fame, and each territorial conquest reinforced the idea that they were invincible. Thus, it wasn't long before they were venerated, not as men, but almost as deities. This cult of strength and fame shaped an entire civilization. Young people grew up hearing stories of legendary giants, of warriors who single-handedly destroyed entire armies, of leaders who ruled lands with an iron fist. Fame became a fuel, and society organized itself around it. Those without power were discarded, those without strength were crushed. The result was a cycle of constant oppression, in which the giants' fame sustained an increasingly brutal model of violence. These men of renown were remembered for their courage and power, but also for the way they led humanity into a state of irreversible corruption. When the example comes from above, the whole society follows, and when leaders are violent and domineering men, the people learn to live the same way. This is exactly what happened. The fame of these giants not only elevated them, but also infected an entire generation. What began as a physical difference transformed into an empire of domination. Their height and strength gave them leadership, but their fame cemented their authority. As if they were untouchable, they were admired, feared, and imitated. Over time, there was no longer a distinction between strength and justice, between leadership and tyranny. What remained was a society in which raw power was the measure of all things. This is the legacy of the giants as warriors and leaders of antiquity. They were not merely isolated figures in history, but a reflection of a world that chose to place fame above truth, strength above morality, and power above all limits. And this is precisely what explains why, even after so long, their names still resonate, because they symbolize the rise of a corrupt elite that forever marked the trajectory of humanity. When we think of giants, it's easy to imagine only their immense strength, impressive height, and battle exploits, but their true impact lies not only in their physical size, but in how they wielded that power. What could have been an extraordinary gift to protect and inspire became a weapon of oppression and fear. It was here that giants ceased to be mere leaders and warriors and became the engine of a corruption that infected all of humanity. Society at that time was fascinated by the idea of power. Those who dominated lands, herds, and cities were revered. In this scenario, giants emerged as irresistible figures. They didn't need to earn respect. It came naturally, simply through their imposing presence. But admiration quickly turned into submission. Strength became an instrument of control, and leadership became a pretext for exploitation. Their power came to be used not to balance but to subjugate, not to build but to destroy. Over time, the giants became the benchmark for success. Young people grew up dreaming of imitating them, of achieving the same fame, of reproducing the same authority. The result was an entire society shaped by the example of violence. What was once the exception became the rule. Fighting, dominating, and instilling fear became signs of greatness. Evil ceased to be condemnable and became celebrated. One can imagine the cities bustling under their rule, markets bustling, artisans producing, musicians playing, and at the center of it all, the giants dictating the rhythm of collective life. But behind the apparent prosperity, corruption spread like a silent disease. Families were torn apart, smaller peoples were crushed, and the morality that should sustain human coexistence was replaced by a code of violence and pride. It didn't take long for this influence to corrode social structures. What was once seen as honor became merely appearance. The pursuit of fame replaced the pursuit of justice. And when fame is the ultimate goal, any means to achieve it is justified. Giants became celebrities of their time, known for their strength but also feared for their tyranny. Corruption wasn't limited to individual acts, it contaminated the collective spirit. And there was something even darker to this story. The more the giants multiplied, the more evil spread. Violence ceased to be occasional and became a culture. It was common to see conflicts between families, bloody disputes between cities, and conquests marked by massacres. What should have been the exception became routine. The world of the giants was a world where brutality was the most spoken language. The worst part is that humanity not only became accustomed to this, but also came to admire it. Giants were praised as examples, as invincible men everyone aspired to emulate. Corruption became invisible because it was disguised as glory. When leaders transform evil into virtue, the people follow without question. This was the most dangerous blow, the inversion of values. Right seemed wrong and wrong, right. This reality explains why the period dominated by the giants is remembered as one of the darkest in human history. They represented not only strong individuals, but also the symbol of an entire society that had lost its way. Their corruption was not limited to robberies or murders. It ran deeper, rooted in people's hearts, shaping their thoughts and daily decisions. The giants' power lay not only in their enormous hands or their physical strength. Their true power lay in their influence. They showed the world that it was possible to achieve fame and authority without morality, without limits. This was the lesson that spread, and it was this lesson that corrupted. The giants' evil was not just a result of their actions, but of their ability to transform the society around them into a replica of its own decay. Their legacy is a warning that resonates to this day. When corrupt leaders become role models, corruption isn't confined to them, but multiplies in every person who follows them. The giants symbolize this collective fall. They didn't just fall, they brought the whole world down with them. When talking about giants, most people think only of brute strength and violence. But there's one detail that's often overlooked. They emerged in an era of impressive human advancement. Long before the world as we know it was reshaped, a complex, creative, and organized civilization existed, and giants were not only part of it, but also seem to have been protagonists of this development. That's why when ancient humanity was destroyed, not only cities and families disappeared, but also a wealth of knowledge that has never been fully recovered. Ancient accounts describe practices surprising for the period: the manipulation of metals, the large-scale domestication of animals, the creation of refined musical instruments, and organized trade between distant regions. None of this fits the image of a primitive society. On the contrary, everything points to a people who had discovered techniques that would only be rediscovered thousands of years later. And at the center of this mechanism were the giants, using their authority and physical power to accelerate this progress. Imagine furnaces being heated to extremely high temperatures to forge iron and bronze. This process requires chemical knowledge, casting techniques, and heat control. Now think of harps, flutes, and other complex musical instruments. Creating a single one of these involves mathematics, acoustics, and manual skills that go far beyond simple experiments. How could such an ancient civilization master so many different areas simultaneously? The giants, by their position, were the guardians and leaders of these discoveries. With their influence, they commanded artisans, organized great works, and perhaps even directed the course of science and culture of the time. Their strength placed them at the top of the hierarchy, but it was their involvement in the construction of cities and the management of resources that transformed them into symbols of a golden age. However, this same ability turned against humanity when it was corrupted by violence and arrogance. Some scholars argue that some of this knowledge may have come from outside, from a less than fully human source. This would explain how such advanced techniques suddenly appeared, with no record of gradual evolution. It's a disturbing hypothesis, but one that becomes plausible given the enigma of the giants. After all, how can we explain that later peoples, centuries after the cataclysm, no longer had access to the same technologies and had to relearn from scratch? When the world was swallowed by the waters, it was not only life that was lost, but also entire libraries of knowledge. Formulas, blueprints, buildings, systems of social organization, all vanished within weeks. Only fragmented memories remained, which became legends passed down from generation to generation. The giants, who had been protagonists of this knowledge, remained alive only in stories remembered as gods, heroes, or monsters. Most impressively, many ruins and archaeological discoveries still intrigue scholars today. Cyclopean structures formed by gigantic stone blocks seem to defy the technology of their builders. Could they be remnants of this lost knowledge? There are no definitive answers, but the similarity with the description of an advanced humanity dominated by beings of unusual stature is hard to ignore. The presence of giants amidst this sophistication makes us realize a paradox. On the one hand, they represented the force that could build cities, develop technologies, and transform collective life. On the other, they carried the corruption that used this same power to destroy and subjugate. They were responsible for leading humanity to a technological peak, but also for dragging it into a moral abyss. This is the forgotten side of the giants' story, not just warriors, but also leaders of an advanced civilization whose secrets disappeared without leaving behind manuals or records. Perhaps that's why their mystery lives on. It's not just the fear of their strength that intrigues us, but the feeling that they held keys to knowledge we still can't decipher. The story of the giants does not end with their glory as warriors or their role in building an advanced civilization. On the contrary, the height of their influence was precisely the harbinger of their downfall. Unchecked power, boundless violence, and corruption that spread like a plague triggered something inevitable: judgment. And this judgment would not be a simple defeat in battle or a shift in empires. It was much greater. It was the sentence that would come in the form of a catastrophe that would wipe out the ancient world in a matter of weeks: the flood. For generations, giants had dominated the earth. Their fame grew, their kingdoms expanded, and their culture of violence became the invisible law that all followed. But while men admired them, believing they represented the future, they were in fact paving the way for their own ruin. Their power, instead of leading humanity to wisdom, plunged everyone into arrogance and brutality. The giants became the reflection of an unbridled humanity, where evil was not the exception but the rule. The judgment came as a response to what seemed irreversible. The giants not only dominated physically, but also corrupted spiritually. They were the symbol of collective decline. They represented a world that had chosen to live as if there were no limits, ignoring any principle of justice. And when leaders fall, the people follow. Thus, an entire society became a mirror of the decadence of its rulers. The flood, in this context, was not just a natural event, but the abrupt end to a history that had spiraled out of control. The civilization of the giants, with all its grandeur, disappeared in days. Entire cities, monuments, technological advances, everything was swallowed by the waters. The seemingly unbeatable humanity was reduced to silence, and with it, the giants who had ruled and spread their fame were also swallowed. It's almost impossible to imagine the scene. Men who were once venerated as demigods find themselves powerless against the relentless force of nature. Warriors who single-handedly defeated armies, now running in vain against ever-rising waters. Leaders who instilled fear in multitudes, now gripped by the terror of realizing there was no escape. All their arrogance crumbled at once, showing that true strength never lay in their muscles or stature, but in something they never possessed: humility before the divine. The flood was the final sentence, a page turned by force, a reminder that no civilization, no matter how advanced, survives when its foundation is built on corruption and pride. The giants were the pinnacle of this decadence, and so they also became the central target of judgment. The ancient world could not continue to exist with them in charge. And yet, the echo of that sentence did not fade. Even after the waters receded and humanity began anew, the name of the giants lived on. Legends, memories, and even new accounts later show that their influence has not completely disappeared, as if the earth itself had preserved fragments of its history, reminding future generations that there was a time when men of immeasurable stature and fame nearly destroyed everything. This judgment was not only against the giants, but against the model they represented. A model in which strength trumps morality, in which fame is more important than truth, in which leaders use power only to oppress. When this logic dominates, downfall is only a matter of time. The flood was the definitive response to a world that had reached its limit. Thus, the destruction of the giants was not only the end of a lineage, but the harshest lesson left for humanity. No power can endure forever when it is removed from balance. No matter how tall they were, the giants could not escape. What remains, centuries later, is the mystery of their rise and the memory of their fall. The flood seemed to be the end. For weeks, the earth was covered in waters that swallowed cities, crops, and any memory of what had come before. When the waters receded, the world would never be the same. A new beginning had been given, a new chance for humanity. It was natural to believe that the giants, with all their power and corruption, had been completely wiped from history. But reality was surprising. Later accounts show that somehow they reappeared. This is one of the most disturbing mysteries. If everything had been destroyed, how can we explain the presence of giants in much later periods? Mentioned in ancient chronicles and feared by people who lived centuries after the cataclysm, entire tribes reported facing enormous men, warriors of superhuman proportions, descendants of a lineage believed extinct. It is as if the shadow of the Nephilim had crossed the waters and survived the judgment. There are different hypotheses for this unexpected return. Some believe that the giant lineage was preserved genetically, hidden in some descendant of the new humanity, and re-emerged in future generations. Others argue that the same beings that gave rise to the first giants have returned to the world, repeating the forbidden interbreeding and recreating a hybrid offspring. Whatever the explanation, one thing is certain: humanity has once again encountered these unusual beings. Stories tell of entire peoples marked by the presence of giants. There were regions known to be home to men so tall that the mere sight of them aroused terror. They occupied strategic territories, built fortresses, and once again spread a culture of violence and war. For many peoples of the time, facing these figures was nearly impossible. They seemed untouchable, protected not only by their physical strength, but also by the aura of invincibility they carried. This return brought back the same dilemma of the antediluvian era: how to coexist with beings who used their power only to dominate. Neighboring peoples recounted humiliating defeats before them, while survivors described them as living mountains, warriors who needed reinforced weapons just to attempt to strike them. These were not isolated legends, but collective memories that spanned centuries, spreading the fame of the giants as if they were immortal. Most impressively, their presence wasn't limited to warfare. Once again, giants occupied positions of leadership. They were kings, tribal chiefs, and lords of fertile lands. Their cities were seen as impregnable fortresses, and their influence extended far beyond the sword. Just as in the ancient world, the giants' fame shaped entire cultures. They became symbols of absolute power, icons that represented both glory and terror. For some scholars, the reappearance of giants after the flood is proof that the problem was not just physical, but spiritual. They represented a force that insists on returning whenever humanity gives way to corruption. They are like an echo of the past, a constant reminder that the fall does not happen all at once, but begins when leaders stray from any moral bounds. The return of the giants shows that humanity had not fully learned the lesson of judgment. Even after the new beginning, their shadows loomed large over the earth. This made them a constant warning. Evil does not disappear easily. It reinvents itself, hides, and when it finds a space, re-emerges even more menacing. This enigma, how the giants could reappear, continues to intrigue to this day. If they were simply large men, why did so many people fear them so supernaturally? If they were merely legends, why did different cultures record such similar stories? The return of the giants is, above all, a reminder that certain forces of history refuse to die. And as long as their memories persist, they will continue to be seen not as mere figures from the past, but as signs of something greater and deeper that has forever marked humanity. When the giants resurfaced after the flood, it didn't take long for them to become the greatest challenge for people seeking to settle in new lands. They were not just common inhabitants, but organized warriors, lords of fortified cities, and leaders of strategic regions. For any people seeking to advance or conquer territories, facing the giants was inevitable, and no confrontation was more striking than those waged against the people of Israel. The story of these encounters is fraught with tension and fear. Imagine a group of travelers, ordinary men and women, looking at seemingly insurmountable walls and discovering that behind them lived men of colossal stature, warriors whose height surpassed any known measurement, soldiers who, in battle, seemed like living towers advancing against their enemies. It wasn't just a matter of military strategy, it was a psychological shock. The giants didn't need to fight to spread terror. The mere news of their presence was enough to paralyze entire armies. Ancient accounts describe these giants as inhabiting immense cities, replete with fortifications, inexplicable to the technology of the time. Enormous gates, walls with tons of stones, towers that seemed erected by inhuman hands. It's as if their very architecture was a constant reminder that they were facing a different race, superior in strength and resources. For Israel, each step toward these lands meant defying not only a physical enemy, but also their own collective fear. Battles against giants became legendary. Some were described as chieftains of entire clans, commanding vast armies. Others appeared as lone warriors, so feared that their victories became stories told for generations. The confrontation wasn't just for territory, but for survival. For the people who faced these beings, defeating a giant was much more than winning a battle. It was challenging the impossible. These encounters also exposed a profound contrast. On one side, the giants represented brute strength, a reliance on body, size, and the weapon that crushed. On the other, Israel represented human fragility, a small people facing a colossal threat. But this fragility hid something greater, the courage to not retreat, even when logic dictated victory was impossible. Each victory against the giants became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the impossible could be overcome. The psychological impact of these confrontations was so great that to this day, giants are remembered as a metaphor for seemingly insurmountable enemies. For Israel, they were not just flesh and blood warriors, but the embodiment of obstacles that tested the faith, courage, and determination of an entire people. Facing a giant meant confronting collective fear, winning not only the physical battle, but also the internal battle against doubt and hopelessness. What makes these stories even more fascinating is that the giants weren't just temporary adversaries. They became enduring symbols, remembered as the most feared enemies that ever existed. They weren't simply the greatest warriors, they were the military and cultural elite of the time, men whose fame crossed borders. When Israel faced them, it wasn't just conquering lands, but debunking the myth that giants were invincible. These confrontations mark a crucial point in the narrative of the giants. For the first time, they cease to be mere legends of the distant past and become concrete, identifiable enemies who needed to be defeated for a people to move forward. It was in this clash between the impossible and courage that one of the most impressive pages in ancient history was born, the fall of the giants before those who, in theory, should never have defeated them. Among all the giants who appeared throughout history, no name echoed as strongly as that of Goliath. He became the definitive symbol of what the Nephilim represented: immense strength, boundless arrogance, and an almost unshakable confidence that no one could defeat him. His figure has stood the test of time as a portrait of the ultimate threat, the seemingly invincible enemy. But his fall also marked the beginning of the end of this feared lineage, as if the giant's last breath had been recorded before everyone's eyes. Goliath wasn't just big, he was the very embodiment of fear. Described as a seasoned warrior, wielding enormous weapons and protected by seemingly insurmountable armor, he presented himself to his adversaries as if he were impossible to defeat. The mere sight of him on the field made entire armies tremble. His height was legendary, but even more impressive was his attitude. He wasn't just confident in his strength, he openly challenged anyone to face him, as if certain no one would be able to overcome him. What few remember is that Goliath was not alone. He had brothers, other giant warriors who also terrorized the surrounding regions. He was not an isolated case, but part of a lineage that still endured. Each of them carried within them the heritage of the ancient Nephilim, reminding humanity that the giants were still present, even after so many battles waged against them. Their presence proved that the echo of the past could still be heard. However, Goliath's defeat changed everything. When an inexperienced youth, unarmored and seemingly without a chance, managed to fell him with a simple stone, the myth of the giant's invincibility began to crumble. Goliath's fall was not just the death of a warrior, but the psychological collapse of an entire idea that the descendants of the Nephilim were unattainable, untouchable, superior to any common man. The deaths of their brothers, recorded in later battles, sealed the fate of this lineage once and for all. Gradually, the stories of giants began to fade into memories. They ceased to be a constant threat and began to live only in campfire tales, remembered as monsters from a bygone era. With this, humanity began to breathe without the constant burden of living under the shadow of the colossuses. Goliath and his brothers represent the giant's last breath. As a real power, they were, in a sense, the closing of a cycle that had begun long before the flood. From the birth of the first Nephilim to the fall of their last descendants, humanity waged a constant battle against this lineage. And when the last were finally defeated, the myth lost its power. But even defeated, the giants did not completely disappear from memory. Goliath's name is still used today as a synonym for something impossible to defeat, an enemy far greater than any human capacity. His story has become a universal metaphor, the struggle between the small and the great, the weak and the powerful, the improbable and the insurmountable. His defeat was more than a military victory. It was a symbolic lesson that has transcended generations. The end of Goliath and his brothers marked the last gasp of giants on earth. After that, no more warriors of such impressive stature were heard of, nor were entire peoples formed by colossal men. The lineage of the Nephilim, which had begun mysteriously and dominated entire civilizations, disappeared before the eyes of history. What remained were legends, memories, and a silent warning. However powerful they may seem, all giants fall. Giants disappeared from battles and ancient cities, but they did not vanish from human memory. On the contrary, they remained alive in legends, oral traditions, and stories engraved on stone and parchment. It's as if, even after their defeat, they still insisted on existing in the collective imagination. This persistence raises an inevitable question. Were giants merely historical figures who existed at a certain point in time? Were they myths created to explain fears and obstacles, or were they signs of something even greater, a prophecy about humanity's future? In almost every great culture, we find echoes of the same narrative: enormous beings, stronger and more powerful than any ordinary human, who dominated the earth in ancient times. The Greeks spoke of the Titans, the Norse, of the Jotuns, the Mesopotamians, of semi-divine heroes. Peoples separated by oceans and millennia have held similar memories. This convergence does not seem coincidental. It is as if everyone is trying to tell, each in their own way, the same story of the colossuses that once walked among us. The legacy of giants in this sense goes beyond archaeology or history. They have become universal symbols, symbols of excessive power, of arrogance that grows without limits, of violence that imposes itself as a rule. That's why even today we call any obstacle that seems impossible to overcome, any enemy that appears greater than us, a giant. The term has gone from being merely a physical description to a metaphor for the human struggle against the impossible. But there's something even deeper. Many believe that giants are not just an echo of the past, but a warning for the future. They represent what happens when humanity crosses boundaries it shouldn't. Their emergence marked a moment when boundaries between worlds were broken, when the desire for power prevailed over balance. And whenever humanity repeats this path, seeking power at any cost, defying natural limits, the ghost of giants returns to haunt us, not as flesh and blood bodies, but as inevitable consequences. Perhaps that's why the giants have never been forgotten. They didn't survive simply because they were impressive in height or strength. They survived because they carry within them a timeless meaning. They are reminders that every time society places strength above justice, fame above morality, and power above life, it creates new giants. Not giants of stone or flesh, but symbolic giants that crush everything around them. The question remains, were the giants, in fact, historical figures who walked among men? Were they merely myths created to explain ruins and confused memories? Or were they both, reality and myth, history and symbol, past and prophecy? The answer may never be definitive, but perhaps the most important thing is not to prove their physical existence, but to understand what they represent. The legacy of the giants is, above all, a warning. They remind us that every excess exacts a price, that no power survives when used only to corrupt, and that even the strongest can fall before something greater. In the end, what the giants left was not just the imprint of their footprints on Earth, but a lesson that resonates to this day. No matter how great the force, no empire based on arrogance and violence endures forever. Giants may have disappeared from battles and ancient cities, but they live on in memories, symbols, and questions that never cease to echo. And perhaps that's precisely where the greatest mystery lies. They weren't just a story about the past, but a reflection of the present, and perhaps a warning about the future. If this topic resonated with you, if the revelations about the giants made sense or raised new questions, share your perspective in the comments. Every opinion here helps keep this conversation alive and shed even more light on secrets many prefer to forget. And if you believe this content needs to reach more people, please like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you'll not only strengthen this journey, but also ensure you'll continue to receive new investigations into mysteries that have changed and may still change humanity.